Michigan. Good afternoon from Michigan. Welcome to the second event in this second installment of Sites of Translation in the Multilingual Midwest, the Mellon-funded Sawyer Seminar Series of the Department of Comparative Literature of the University of Michigan. I am Marlon James Sales, postdoctoral fellow in critical translation studies, and I am coordinating the three virtual events that we're having today under the title Translation and Memory, Hispano-Filipino Literature in the Archive in the U.S. Midwest. These events would have been impossible without the gracious support of our major co-sponsors, namely the University Library and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies of the University of Michigan. We're also very thankful for the help extended to us by the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, and the LSA Technology Services. I am also personally thankful to Julia Irion Martins, our graduate research assistant for this seminar, and to Lisa Chun, our events specialist at Complit, for helping out in the publicity and coordination of these three events. And I'm also very thankful for all the help extended to us by the wonderful team from the University Library, whom I will introduce later in the launch of our book exhibit. We would also like to thank Literati for being our local bookstore partner in Ann Arbor. As I did this morning, I would just like to remind everyone that we're implementing a few housekeeping rules. We are on a Zoom webinar for these back-to-back events. So audience members cannot see themselves on screen and cannot see who else is in the room, as far as I know. At any point of the conversation, please feel free to use the Q&A button to type in your questions or comments, and we will try our very best to accommodate all of them later. Please include your name and affiliation if you want to do so. Also note that all our events will be recorded and the recording will be uploaded to our website in due course. At 4 p.m. Eastern, like after this event, we will immediately have our launch of the virtual book exhibit with the title The Literary Worlds of the Spanish Philippines that I have curated with a team from the University Library. It will be a short 15-minute program, so I hope you can stay for that. So let's now proceed to our second event. Translation is usually an invisible undertaking, but this conversation surprisingly comes on the heels of many translation-related controversies that have piqued the interest of international media of late. Within days apart, Amanda Gorman's Dutch and Catalan translators were removed from their respective translation projects because of problems of authenticity and representation. As I have said this morning, these controversies are not new. Translation has always been suspected of treachery. The Italians even have a saying for it, traduttore traditore, the translator is a traitor. The question of why certain texts get translated by certain translators into certain languages for certain people has generated many interesting intellectual exchanges in the field of translation theory and practice. As far as the Hispano-Filipino canon goes, the question seems mostly restricted to the works of our national hero, Jose Rizal. His two novels, The Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, both written in Spanish toward the end of the 19th century, are the two foundational novels of the Filipino nation. However, as I have said in the morning, also, since Spanish has never really been spoken as a majority language in the Philippines, Rizal's novels are generally accessed by their intended national audience in translation. I am using the term translation capaciously here to refer, on the one hand, to the transfer of a text from a source language to a target language, and on the other, to various processes of cultural mediation and rewriting even that transform the text with a specific objective in mind. In this conversation this afternoon, I am quite honored to welcome two writers who can address these topics very well. The first one is Harold Augenbrum, who is the former executive director of the National Book Foundation of the United States and the current associate director of the Translation Initiative of the Macmillan Center at Yale. A prolific editor, writer, and translator, he has translated Rizal's No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo to English for Penguin Classics. And I know that he has also finished his translation of Pedro Paterno's Ninay, the first novel ever written by a native Filipino. Harold will be joined by award-winning novelist Gina Apostol. Gina's novel Ilustrado, which I have here.
Insurrecto.
Yep. Insurrecto, I'm sorry, was named by Publishers Weekly as one of the 10 best books in 2018. And her latest publication is The Revolution, according to Raimundo Mata. This one, which has won the Philippine National Book Award in 2010 and has recently been published for its US release. I want to be as unobtrusive as possible. So before I disappear from the screen in a few, please know that Harold and Gina will have an opening spiel of about 3 to 4 minutes each. And after this, a conversation between them will proceed freely until about 3:45 p.m. I will then turn on my cam at that point and join the conversation to moderate the Q&A with the questions that you have written down using the Q&A function. Again, if at any point you feel that you have to leave a comment or ask a question, please feel to do so using that Q&A button. So without much ado, I'll turn you over to Gina and Harold.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Marlon, for inviting me. I love the academic word that you used for my opening remarks, which is an opening spiel, which is actually perfect for me. I'd also like to thank Julia for her help and to Gina for joining us here today. Gina and I are old friends, and it's really a pleasure to just be able to talk to her and see her since we haven't seen each other in about a year now, I think. I'm always happy to talk about Rizal, and I'm going to try and be brief and just read a few introductory remarks. I keep it to 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll go from there, and then Gina will join us. I actually came across Rizal accidentally. I was researching titles for a bibliography of U.S. Latino prose fiction writers in English, and I happened on N.V.M. Gonzalez's The Bread of Salt. Since there was no translator listed and I was unfamiliar with the fact that Filipinos were forced into taking Spanish surnames in 1949 by the colonial government, I assumed that Gonzalez was U.S. Latino. But then I read the dust jacket, the paratextual material, and I quickly realized my error and my ignorance became clear. And that actually turned out to be a good thing, since it led me not only to reading that book, but Rizal's 2 novels and several biographies of Rizal. Obviously, there are many ways to look at translation in the writing of the Filipino nation, which is the crux of what we're talking about this afternoon. There's the history and analysis of the absence or the presence of translation in the period from 1875 to 1910, which was really the time that they were trying to write the national history of the Philippines. For example, but there's also the reconfiguring today of what we would consider accepted history, and that's one of the things that Gina is going to talk about. That comes through new translation of historical work and contextualization according to its era. I'll talk about my own experience in that, which I think will draw us into a discussion with Gina of the composition of a historical novel and critical practice, especially since in her work she's questioned the fiction writer's responsibility to historical accuracy. For the contemporary translator, the decision to translate already translated classic texts, especially those as influential in the Philippines as Jose Rizal's No Le Metangere and El Filibusterismo, requires a great deal of reflection. In the first place, when you translate a classic work, you confront past translations. You create a contra translation, even when you don't mean to. Translations of the same source text argue with one another, whether they like it or not. So why would you translate a work that's been translated many times before? Well, you have to be dissatisfied with earlier translations, and you should be able to articulate the reason, which I was and I could. And please note that I'm leaving out the commercial attraction of retranslation, which is another story altogether and could make up a seminar on its own. I had two main reasons for wanting to retranslate Noli Me Tangere in particular, and a couple of minor ones. The first was that I fell in love with both Rizal and the Noli, and I wouldn't minimize the word love in that statement. This morning, in one of the panels, somebody mentioned the idea of emotional labor, and it seemed like it was a bit of that emotional labor was a cost to the person who was doing that labor. But I think that when you're talking about translation and sometimes writing biography, you're also talking about, and let's put it in Marxist terms, there's a sort of income and expense. And the emotional labor is a positive thing and not a negative thing. It plays a great role in the translator's decision to translate a literary work. I'll add that one reason for translating the work of an author you admire is to affect his or her legacy. You want to control your heroes in a way. This The second reason was that when I made my decision, the book was unavailable in the United States. I read five translations of the Noli. First, I read the Guerrero translation, then the Laxon Laxin, then Derbyshire, then Bassa, and finally Ventura Castro. And in between, I read the original Spanish. I thought that Guerrero had missed a great deal of Rizal's humor and saw that he had omitted several passages, which I later learned critics had ascribed to his protection of social classes. Derbyshire I thought was outdated. Laxon Laxin had mistakes that I found. In Rizal, as in Proust, speech-based social class and geographic origin are key to understanding the characters' interactions. Among the five translations, I felt none of them captured in English Rizal's linguistic carnival. And a translation would reintroduce his work and Philippine colonial history to the United States, which I also found very personally satisfying. In general, when you translate a classic, you don't want to either overreach or underreach, which is a danger. Translating from country one for a readership to country two, usually in country one, they don't speak the language of country two, and vice versa, and they don't have any idea about the cultural history of one or the other. So you have to show some sort of excitement, but you also have to show some restraint. In this is a complicated case in many ways because people in the Philippines can also read English, but they can't read the original Spanish. So you would also be translating for the population of the Philippines, which is not your normal type of translation direction. And they might know more about the Philippines, of course, than the Americans would, who in country two, let's put it that way. But because the action takes place 150 years ago, some Filipinos might not be familiar with the 19th century customs, even if their own country, as we in the United States aren't in many regional ways. So not only are you translating the body text, but you're also creating meta text and paratext. And that enters the translation equation because it becomes a whole. You think about what to include about the source text's author, how to explain the politics of the time, how many and what type of explanatory footnotes are necessary, and whether to include a foreword or afterword. All of these choices affect a reader's perspective. They can contextualize or over contextualize, and what you include can also monumentalize. You have to understand the level of your own authorization in doing a classic translation. So when we talk about translation as a critical practice, what I think we're also saying is how much does the translator participate in the reader's perception of the work? Along with the ghostly presence of the author of the original text, the translation becomes the work for the target text reader because it's based on the decisions the translator makes, even when the reader thinks she is reading the source author. In particular, when you read the Penguin Classics edition of Noli Me Tangere, you are reading Harold Augenbraum's critical re-edition of Jose Rizal's Noli. You're also reading Rizal's depiction of late 19th century Central Philippines, 150 years of Philippine history, Harold Augenbraum's diction and syntax, and Harold Augenbraum's anxious contextualization. These mediations telescope the original. So just as when you read Gina Apostol's novel about a massacre in Samar, you're reading Aposol's version, not a history or a fictional filmmaker's history. You're reading Gina's reimagination of events from which she is separated right now by 120 years and 8,000 miles. Her book is then published in the United States, where readers may have no idea about the history of the Philippines. There are lots of other questions about translation that might define it as a critical practice, including decisions on what texts were and were not translated in the late 19th century, about which Judy Celine Ick has written, who does the translation and why, who encourages or discourages translation in a late colonial environment and why, in what ways translation is interpretive or hermeneutical. Can translation itself be commentary? The body text, can it be commentary? Can it be metatext? Can it be paratext itself? And the role language played in the late 19th century Philippines, about which Vicente Rafael has so ably written. But time is short, and I'm going to turn things over to Gina to comment.
I don't have anything prepared, but I did. We talked a little bit, Harold, about your translator as translation as critical practice, and what I thought was really interesting about that was that it was actually describing the way my book is structured, and it describes actually also ways in which I approached the two novels, but I'll start with this one, The Revolution, according to Raimundo Mata. And the fact that this is in many ways a way of translating for myself as well as for the reader that I was making in the novel, a way of reading Rizal. So translating a way that I read Rizal. I really wanted to see Rizal. So this novel, if you see the cover of the novel, this is the Juan Luna painting of Rizal, that with the overlay of the title of The Revolution according to Raimundo Mata. That's the fact that Rizal is on this cover in a book about a figure called Raimundo Mata lies in the fact that this entire novel is a kind of translation of Rizal for me, an idea of Rizal that I wanted to grapple with. I didn't quite know exactly how it would turn out, but what I wanted was to translate the love, a love for Rizal as an artist, as a writer, because he is definitely the monumentalized image in the Philippines. His statue is in every town, except for some towns in Ilocos, I think, which have the lunas. But so the monumentalizing of Rizal, I think, in some ways misreads him in many ways as a writer, as an artist, because if you're thinking of someone as an artist, you're thinking of someone who revises, you're thinking of someone who thinks about, who might edit his work, you're thinking of someone who might have writer's block, you're thinking of so much contingency. And there's not a sense of contingency in the figure of Rizal, really. He's just this guy plastered with his overcoat, usually in the European outfit. Very few Rizal in the barong, or very few Rizal, planting the abaca in Dapitan. So I wanted a Rizal that revised. I wanted a Rizal that made errors. I wanted a Rizal that thought twice. So I created Raimundo Mata. But if you notice what I did with that, in order to be able to do that translation of Rizal, I had to confront all the different ways that Rizal is read, and really figure out how to speak to that multiplicity of Rizals for the Filipino. Obviously, Rizal is a figure of nationalism. So in my book, I just have all of these footnotes. More or less, my book is, I'll just show you a sample. This is all more or less what you have at the bottom there. That's all footnotes. And so there are three commentators on the text. My pseudo Rizal, which is the Raimundo Mata Journal. One is a nationalist, because I think that's really, also I think that's a comic way of dealing with Rizal, because he's so iconic that it almost verges sometimes on the absurd, you know, how we see Rizal in this in this completely and unapologetically heroic way, which I believe is correct in many ways, because I do think Rizal, we're very lucky to have Rizal as the hero figure. Uh, but there's a lot of comedy in nationalism. I just find nationalism somewhat funny. There's also another commentator that I have, this meta narrative, this paratext that becomes the major text in many ways of the novel, is a psychoanalyst of the Filipino revolutionary, of the Philippine Revolution, which I think is also interesting for the Filipino, because this particular psychoanalyst is interested in how words, why you choose certain words. And then there's, of course, the translator. So that's where we are here with, her name is Magsalin. And the translator, of course, for a Filipino, you know what Magsalin means. It means to translate or to transfuse, you know, as in transfuse blood, Magsalin ng dugo. But Magsalin happens to be the middle name of Crisostomo Ibarra. So that is the name of Ibarra's mom. And I think that's, that to me was a really beautiful joke, intralingual joke by Rizal in his text. He has many of these uses of the Tagalog in the novel, as you know. And so there's that, I love the concept of everything being in some way contingent in a way to read Rizal, where someone has a claim, the nationalist makes a claim, the psychoanalyst says, boo, I don't believe that shit. The translator says, but hello, here's what the actual text says. And the translator is the only one with the so-called original text. And so this kind of instability of text is how I experience a reading of Rizal. And so this kind of translatability of the concept of Rizal, of the concept of the self, for me, is so endemic. It's so much part of the way I exist as a Filipino, that so the theme of translation is constantly, the theme of mediation is constantly part of my novel making. True also of Insurrecto, which had a translator as a main character. I'm gonna stop there. I don't know if there's any comment, something that I need to add.
But yeah, the other question is, you sort of like, these are historical novels.
Yeah.
And when you're creating these historical novels, you're sort of, let's talk about the use of Rizal in the Philippines and elsewhere. And you're sort of refashioning Rizal in many ways through your fiction by creating characters who actually write arguments other than, you know, what is the accepted and the received wisdom about Rizal all the way through. So are you translating this type of era, or are you transfiguring history, or are you taking history and saying, this isn't the way I like it, so I'm going to do it a different way?
No.
And what type of authorization do you feel as an artist doing that? When I talk about authorization as a translator, I couldn't do that. First of all, I'm not Filipino, and I didn't have the authorization to make those changes or even question the received wisdom about Rizal anywhere in the country. I simply had to report it without even, maybe a little bit of analysis, but it had to be more reporting. You, in a different way, are changing perceptions by putting new voices in there.
I don't think I'm changing perceptions. The reason why I say that is because this is how I experience the Filipino and Rizal. Every Filipino has his or her own Rizal. I mean, in general, it's the Rizal. I mean, I'll show you something that I had to do as a child, okay? I had to read these books. Rizal, grade 3, his student days. Rizal, grade 5, his travels. I grew up with Rizal, like this shadow boy with me every year. But by grade 6, Rizal died. So I was kind of happy because, okay, I'm done with Rizal. But, every Filipino has his Rizal. And of course, it's the received Rizal, the one that comes from schooling. And so all of these different Rizals that we have are part of the reality of Rizal. I would say that. And if you, even when I spoke to historians about Rizal, for instance, I talked about Rizal. So Raimundo Mata is about that. I found out that in order for the revolutionaries to see Rizal and ask him, Rizal, can we go to war? Should we go to war? They had to visit him in Dapitan, and you could only be a doctor with a patient to visit Rizal in Dapitan when he was exiled, because he was a prisoner. But so they have an actual doctor, Pio Valenzuela, and they have an actual blind guy, Raimundo Mata, who goes to see Rizal, and that's a very famous conversation. It's so famous that no one actually really kind of knows what actually happened in that conversation, but it's a pivotal conversation, because if Rizal had said, yes, let's go to war, there would have been this imprimatur right away, and it would have really strengthened the concept of revolution. Because of the ambiguity of whether Rizal wanted to go to war or not, there's this huge, there's a lot of discussion about Rizal as coward, reformist. He just wanted to go to Cuba and be a doctor, all of these different things. So even in that one, and the historians that I've spoken to will say, Pio Valenzuela's a liar, whatever he said was dumb. That's how it's received. So the history of Rizal is received in a very contentious way. So the fact that I write my novel, for me, it is a translation of how we receive Rizal. So the fact that it's highly contentious, contested concept of Rizal, it's all individual translations through the personalities of the characters in Raimundo Mata, of the character annotators in Raimundo Mata. For me, that is realism, and it is not fantastical. It is how people receive Rizal through personal ways, through the ways that they've been educated, through their particular stances, as whether you're Marxist, whether you're Maoist, whether you're reformist, whether you're bourgeois, the bourgeois, all of these different ways that you receive Rizal. Now, Guerrero, for instance, he's definitely a bourgeois reader of Rizal, a bourgeois reader of Rizal. And so so for me, I can't say that anything I did in Raimundo Mata or Insurrecto was made up. What it is it's telling us about that fascinating contingency. And instability is not the best term, because the instability of the way we receive our histories is, in fact, in my view, the way all history could judiciously be read. Like, George Washington. There's so many different ways to read. I mean, the way people are revisioning Lincoln right now. For me, my novels just tear that reality open.
Let's talk a little bit about when you showed those books a minute ago. What language were they in?
They were all in English.
Okay, so they're all in English. And you and I have talked about this before, that in the 1956 Jose Rizal law, we've talked about the idea that the foundational novel of the Philippines is something that Filipinos cannot read in the original language. And it is actually inscribed in the Rizal law that translations have to be made available throughout the Philippines. They're written in Spanish, but it actually says translations must be available. And that's something that I've often found is very different from most other countries. When I talked before about the idea of country one and country two, here we are in the source country, and they can't read Rizal in the foundational novel in the source language. And so you're reading this in English, and it's not even the language. Now, when you look at one of the interesting things about translating the Noli in particular is the idea that language itself is malleable and language itself is unstable. So each person or each social class has a different language. One of the things that came out in the panels this morning was the idea of when somebody writes something in another language from which it occurred. So, for example, if something happened in Spanish in the Philippines, in Tagalog in the Philippines, and yet it was written down in Spanish, there is no source text for that.
Mhm.
And what's interesting, I think, about the way Rizal wrote was to destabilize the language itself, because he is writing in Spanish things that had to have been occurring in Tagalog in
Tagalog.
his own mind in fiction. And so from time to time, and this is a translator's trick that he was using
Yeah.
without, it's not a translation, but a translator's trick to show you, every once in a while he says, this conversation took place in Tagalog. But
Tagalog.
instead he writes it in Spanish. And it's an interesting aspect of sort of like destabilizing the novel that I think that you have used
Mhm.
in Raimundo Mata in particular, is to destabilize the narrative.
Yeah.
And that destabilizes the language in the narrative so that you're not really sure when you're reading the Noli what language is being spoken and in which way it's being spoken. Is it in broken Tagalog? Is it in broken Castilian? Is it in Tagalog itself? And you find this in almost every character. The corporal's wife, one of the great comic scenes in the
Consolacion.
Noli, is when he tries to teach her the F, the sound of the F, and she can't get it. And every time he says Philippines, she says Philippines, he says Philippines. But he's destabilizing all the language. And I think, in reading Raimundo Mata in particular, I think that the destabilization of the narrative there has a sort of similarity to the destabilization of the Philippine culture at that time. And you're looking back and destabilizing it again by introducing characters who use a different historical tone to create about Rizal.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And you know what? What I wrote down here from what you had said was no source text. Can you imagine that? A people who um, have gained a sense of themselves through, in many ways, a lot of ways, through this man's speech, through this man's text, through this man's novels, through this man's uh, ways of doing words. Um, but ultimately, because he can't be read in the original because of the ways of colonization, because of these facts of history, um, you seem to have no source text, and yet you exist with that text. It's an interesting paradoxical thing for a writer. That's gold.
Yeah, that's gold. But for
Yeah.
an historian, it's not. And
Huh?
that's one of the things about, for a historian, it's not. So what you end up with, I think, is there's too much contingency for a historian. And what you end up with in 1875 to about 1910, which the times I meant before, was the desire to write the national source text.
Yeah.
And in trying to write the national source text, it was trying to overcome the national source text that the Spanish had written for the Philippines. And one of the reasons that I brought up early in my remarks about the 1849, the Catálogo Alfabético de Apellidos, which was this long list of book that the Spanish had been developed that were approved names for Filipinos, is they were trying to translate Filipinos themselves into Spanish subjects, not Spanish citizens, but Spanish subjects, by changing their very name, sort of an onomastics of source text, so that they became sort of an in-between. Their names themselves were sort of in between. And from 1875 to about 1910, they tried to rewrite that text to make it a Philippine text. And it's an interesting thing, when I go back to my discovery of, of NVM Gonzalez and my not knowing this. And it seems to me that that the historical contingencies that you talked about before, that you use in your novel, existed well before that.
Mhm.
Existed once There's an educational, there's sort of education in the Philippines starting in the 1860s, and the Ilustrados get developed. It was sort of beginning this idea that there was a new source text about the Philippines, and that Rizal was writing it, Paterno was writing it, and Isabel de los Reyes was writing it, and all these people were writing it, and they were trying to figure out what it was because they didn't have that stable historical source text on which to build, and they were trying to build it from scratch. And it's still, in many ways, if you look at Rizal as sort of the character of that, and I wrote about this in the introduction to the Noli, if you look at him as sort of the character of this, it's almost impossible, because if you've only been writing the source text of Philippine history for 120 years, before that it was written by other people, then it's kind of, it becomes a contingent, unstable.
I have to say it's even worse. I would say it's even worse because if you're looking at 1875 to 1910, and if you're looking at the kind of the nation making that was happening in the early 20th century, that is under the aegis of the colonizer, of the American colonizer. So that is still very much, so that's why you have someone like Guerrero, who, I mean, he was lambasted more or less by Benedict Anderson in that essay on the translation of Rizal, which was really fascinating for me because Guerrero is like, very, very well known, very, he's in that group of Filipinos that you don't recognize if you're growing up as being like a problematic person because you grow up under American colonized education, and he was very much an Americanist, and so you have to also see the work of nation making that was happening in the early 20th century from the point of view of imperialism, the imperial project that America had as well. So it's it's highly, very, very problematic. The texts that so-called created a nation in that era as well, because they're also following a different colonizer. And in terms of, I think the way I read historians doing this work today is that they recognize contingency and they recognize power. That's the way you have to read history, read these books at this point in time. You have to recognize empire and the ways that empire produced meanings, produced a concept of Rizal that was perhaps not the same concept of Rizal that the revolutionaries had, that the Katipuneros had. The concept of Aguinaldo, figuring out Aguinaldo is another project because clearly he was an enemy of the Americans. Therefore, he was, whenever we hate Aguinaldo, we're following the footsteps of the Americans. You have to consider empire in the figure of Aguinaldo. At the same time, Aguinaldo was a shit. He was definitely a kind of a shit guy. If you read his two memoirs, and I read both of his memoirs, which are in Gunita. I read them in translation, but I think they're in Tagalog. I think they're in Tagalog. I'm not sure. I have to go and check that out. So everything has to be mediated for me. The Filipino text, the Filipino nation-making text always has to be mediated. It's always in translation, and the translation must include power. Who is writing? What class is that person? How does that person interrogate that class? Rizal, and this is the beauty of Rizal, he was doing that from day one. People fault Rizal for his Burgess aspect, and his class, he definitely has a class position, but the ways in which he interrogates class and different layers of society in the Noli, you have to give it to the guy. He is constantly pulling triggers. There's always a dagger out. And there's certainly the romanticizing of the peasant, who is actually just another former land, Elias is just another former landowner who lost his land. But then you have to move into that space of, you have to translate that too and say, well, he's a landowner, Elias is a landowner who lost his land, but that is the figure of the Filipino. He is the owner of these islands who lost his land. So you have to keep translating all of these figures, and all of these texts, thinking about issues of power, colonization, empire, and the nation making that all nations do, by the way. It's not just the Filipinos.
Hmm. Well, I think it's also interesting about that period, and this is something that has not seen the light of day, and that's the translation of Ninay by Pedro Paterno. And one of the things that, just to bring in Adam Lifshitz, who was speaking this morning, has written some very interesting things about the subversiveness of Paterno's American era plays. And he claims that they actually were very subversive of the administration, the American administration in the first decade of the 20th century. But you also find there's a wonderful doctoral thesis that came out of the University of Washington about 10 years ago, when talking about the image of the Philippines, both outside the Philippines and inside the Philippines, as being built from ethnographies and travel journals that were written by non-Filipinos and, in most cases, non-Spaniards. So it becomes an international vectoring of untranslated works that the Spanish didn't necessarily want to have translated into Spanish and available in the Philippines. So they kept certain things out. When I mentioned Judy Celine Nick before, she has talked about Rizal using Shakespeare, but not all of Shakespeare being available in the Philippines at the time.
I mean, it's Macbeth in the Noli is not the correct Macbeth.
Right.
that fisherman guy, that doesn't occur in Macbeth at all.
Yeah, and the epigraph is Shakespeare's Ghost, which is, of course, not by Shakespeare, but it's Shakespeare's Ghost. And that's sort of the absence of Shakespeare in many ways in the Philippines in the late 19th century sort of begins to, appear as a ghost. As Rizal does later on, he becomes the ghost. So.
But let's say even with Shakespeare also misnames people from the Greek from Greek mythology. So it's just all over the place. So anyway.
Well, thank you so much for that very stimulating talk about Rizal and how he is mediated and how we access them in the Philippines through translation. So I'm gonna give our attendees some time to type down their questions or any comments using the Q&A function that you have here on screen. But I just want to point out some of the interesting themes that have been coming out since this morning about translation in Hispano-Filipino literature. What I find so fascinating in all our discussions is the fact that we are accepting that there is such a thing as an unsourced translation. Yeah. I find that so fascinating, and it's I really want to know, because this is not the first time that I have encountered this concept in translation studies, but curiously that concept comes out in Latin American studies and Hispanic studies a lot. And the first time that I encountered it was in a paper written about how missionaries were reporting what they were seeing in the New World for the first time. And the scholar called the translations as translations of non-textualized originals. So we have the translation, but there wasn't really, an original textualized text to begin with. Another thing that I find fascinating in our conversation here right now is that both Gina and Harold are openly admitting that what they're doing as translators, as writers of Rizal is a task of refashioning, rereading, reimagining, retelling of Rizal. There was a point in the past, when you talk about translation studies and when you begin talking about rewriting something, that's readily a sign that's, it's taken as a sign that, you're not doing what you should be doing as a translator. So like I'm really psyched that there's this openness now to be more reflective, as it were, in terms of what we are doing as translators, as writers, in terms of our subjectivity and agency. So there's a question.
I have something actually, can I
Yeah.
just want to, I think that there's, the terminology is very interesting. I know Adam Ritchie used the term unsourced text. I think that there is probably a way to break that down a little bit more, because there's not necessarily there can be an unsourced text, but there's also something that you would call an uninscribed text. And so that when you find, I did something on John Steinbeck's The Pearl once a couple of years ago, wrote a paper about it. The Pearl was based on a supposed folktale that Steinbeck heard in Baja, Mexico. And then he writes this, he relates it in a diary. And then he writes The Pearl, which is a novelization of this whole thing. And the point was that even though he relates it in English. He never relates it in Spanish. And we don't know what the real source text was. We only know that there was a source text, but it's an uninscribed source text. And it's not necessarily not a source text, but it's uninscribed, and it's not something that may be shared that everybody knows. So that, that's sort of, one thing. I'm not sure about that. And when I look at Rizal's Noli, and this is one of the things I said before that I'd like to reiterate, is that there is a source text when people are speaking Tagalog, but remember, this is fiction. We don't know if Rizal imagined it in Tagalog first and then wrote it in Spanish, or whether he wrote directly in Spanish. So the source text itself for those conversations in his mind are contested. We don't know in which language he was thinking about those things. And I think that's one of the things that you find in colonial literature or in immigrant literature in the United States, for example. People grow up speaking one language and they report on those conversations in another language. So there is a source text, but it's not necessarily an inscribed text.
I'm going to posit here, Harold, that is how Filipinos exist. That you're constantly in the mode of, you hear someone say one thing and you speak about it in a completely different language because the other person doesn't speak Waray. And that's just normal. That's what I mean by the realism of what I'm doing. I just think it's how we exist. As you're saying, it's not just the writer doing that. It's just everyone in the Philippines does that. I mean, if you're listening to, you speak, I speak Waray, and you have to listen to the radio, and the radio isn't going to be in Tagalog in the morning because the radio is in Tagalog in the morning. The TV is in English at night. So you're just processing everything in multiple languages. And whenever you speak about it, you just do the translation right off the bat. So, when Rizal will say, when Padre Damaso says, that bata there over, I translate that right away. I just include the bata that Rizal used in the sentence, but Padre Damaso said it in Spanish. I just said it in English.
Yep. We have a question from Professor Loredana Polezzi, who is the president of the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies. And she's a professor now of Italian at Stony Brook. I would love to hear both Gina and Harold expand on authority versus authorization. It's a really interesting distinction. It seems to me that authority is asserted and authorization is granted. So how does that relate to their own positions, to your own positions?
Harold?
Give me that again. Authority is
asserted and authorization is granted. Would that be a distinction that?
Yeah, I think that there's also a political distinction here. Authority to me comes from research, knowledge, understanding of your subject matter. And authorization is political, and it comes from what you believe that the outside world would allow you to do. And it's not necessarily what they allow you to do, but what you believe that they would allow you to do. So authority, I also think, is what you would know and be able to project, and authorization is what other people will permit you to do.
I love that question. I never thought about it. And I do know that as a novelist, doing work on actual figures, um, and then making up figures that are speaking to these historical figures, that must be a kind of constant question for a reader of my novels. And what's interesting to me is how I don't think about the question of either authority or authorization at all. So if you're looking at it as authority, as asserted that you have done all of the research, you've worked on, certainly I would assert that I have that authority. I That's where I feel a burden. I feel the need to do the research. If I'm creating a novel within a particular historical period, I will do that research. And that might be the weight of authority on me, that I feel I didn't need to research Raimundo Mata as a writer. I could just have completely made him up. I felt the weight of authority. And so I did all of this research on that period, and whatever I could find about Raimundo Mata. Here's what I did not do. I did not visit Raimundo Mata's family. When I was told that they lived right there near the Aguinaldo Shrine, I did visit. That is perhaps authorization, where I said, there are things that I'm going to be doing that I gave myself that freedom to create. After doing all of my authority business, I created the freedom for myself. I created the boundaries that would allow me to write a novel, because a novel is not a history book. And so that, for me, I thank you very much for this distinction, because I don't think about the moves that I'm making as a writer, but I do know that I'm recognizing boundaries as I'm making them, and that I'm making boundaries in order for me to write, in order for me to do the art that I need. So thanks.
Mhm. We have a question from Liam, who's asking, I think of translation as a way of reading, and I find both Raimundo Mata and Insurrecto drawing attention to the practice of reading. Could you speak, I think this is for Gina, could you speak more about the active processes of reading in these contexts?
Yeah, thank you very much. That is absolutely central to, I would say, to all of my novels. My first novel is actually called Bibliolepsy. So it is about a reader. That's all it is. But the act of reading in the novel is both, it's in the novel itself, in the way the novel is written. The reader is being addressed at certain points. And there are, of course, readers in Raimundo Mata. In Insurrecto, the reader is addressed through the way the narrative moves. And the way I see that is that I guess I'm very interested in what I call an ethics of reading. You know, that an ethics of reading for me is you're understanding the text as outside of yourself. And then you're understanding that it's something that you need to empathize with, you need to kind of understand, comprehend. At the same time, my novels recognize you as a reader have an individual space.
Mhm.
Your contingencies, your identities, your politics, etc., move you in different ways. And so my books will address those gaps, those interstitial things that occur, when you're reading, and especially in our times, especially for the reader who is said to be outside of the mainstream. Although for me, every single person, every single reader is his or her mainstream.
Mhm.
his or her center, and I'm very aware of those kind of moves. So there's an ethics of reading, there's a politics of reading that I'm interested in as well, because generally we do we center the majority gaze, but I want to constantly remind my reader about that decentering that needs to be done.
Mhm. One question from Nerissa Balse of Stony Brook. For Harold, Jean has been interviewed and quoted about her love for Rizal as an artist and as a historical figure. Is there something about Pedro Paterno that draws you to translate Ninay? In other words, why Paterno?
Why put them? I think that Ninai in particular is a very interesting text, and the reason that it's interesting is because it's structured in a variety of different ways that talk about and draw attention to itself as a work of art and as a work of ethnography. And I think that it reflects in many ways more of what was the goals of the propaganda movement at that period of time than Rizal's novels do. I mean, I think that Rizal was a genius, and he had this very cohesive work of art that I think worked very well. Paterno um, actually shows you what he is doing with the structure of the work. If you haven't read it, and it really only is in Spanish, only it's been available in Spanish, but if you haven't read it, it's structured as over a 9-day period. So it uses Filipino folklore as its basic structure, but it also uses these outside ethnographic texts as footnotes. It's about 2/3 footnotes. And using those ethnographic texts, I think, inform not only the reader of the melodramatic text itself, melodramatic story itself, but it informs it about what the propaganda movement itself is trying to do.
Mhm. Right. I,
Paterno is one of those figures of where you have the intersection with his life and all of that it becomes very contentious. So I love that contest with Paterno.
I think this is going to be the last question for our conversation, but we'll try to do it as quickly as possible. It's from an anonymous attendee who said, I feel a deep dissatisfaction in the idea of a nation's history, which is a text anyway, as a kind of unsourced text, which seems to follow from the talks. In the case of the Philippines, pre-colonial texts were destroyed or ignored, so there could be no source of authenticity for the Filipinos, their true soul, language, history, or even literature, since everything has been mediated, translated, relativized. So, do you feel that the Filipinos will always exist only in translation, or in the gaps between narratives transcribed by others and even by themselves?
Here's what I completely understand that, and I completely understand that kind of it is actually something that drives me. One of the things that drives me to write is really that question, and kind of it seems like a question of deficit that we think that we consider. We talk about the unsourced text, but I do not see it as deficit. I see it as opportunity to keep what it makes us, what it makes of us is we are a continually reflexive people. Because we are always and actually I guess for me as a writer it makes creation just that much more powerful and urgent. But one thing I would say about that, it's not, if we think about ourselves, if we think about the text that is us, it lies in the fact that we have kept our languages. We have kept them. And we will hear our history. We will hear, I think we will, we need to really look at it very carefully, and we need to study these, how we speak very, with true imagination, profound imagination. But our languages are our ur text, the fact that we still have them and we still speak them. And um, we should, okay, I'll use a Tagalog, talagang dapat magkalkal. And we really need to delve into the languages that we actually speak as our texts. We are the source texts.
And with that, I think please join me in thanking Gina and Harold virtually. Thank you so much for this very illuminating conversation. I would like to invite the other hosts of this webinar to turn on their camera so that you can see them on screen. We have intended to have this as a champagne and canapes sort of thing, but obviously we don't have that luxury of meeting in person, so we have to do the launch of our exhibit virtually. Um, but before we give you the link so that you can go through our exhibit, I would just like to acknowledge and each of the team members who made this exhibit possible, and perhaps ask them to give us some words about the experience of mounting the exhibit and how it has been. We could probably start with Barbara Alvarez, who is our librarian in Complete and the head of the International Studies section of our library.
Yes, thank you, Marlon. Good afternoon, everybody. I have to say that it has been a great pleasure and learning to embark on this journey with Marlon, my colleague Susan Go, Charlotte and Julia, who are our students, and to discover the world of the Hispano-Filipino literature in our library, because you know, we are very well known for the collection of the primary sources for the history of the Philippines. But it was great to delve into the literary side of our collection and to see how good that collection is. I have to say that this has been a journey and an adventure, also in a different sense, because this project has started in the pre-pandemic era, and we have been started to prepare a physical exhibit that you all could visit in person in one of our libraries. And soon we started to plan for it in January, and very soon we went into lockdown, and so we had to switch our sort of mode of work, adapt to the remote environment, and sort of try to design still a physical exhibit, but working only with images. And we have done all this. We have been working on this all summer, and then it was we saw that we will not have a chance to have a physical exhibit at all. So switch gears another time to transition into virtual mode, and sort of transition also into the character of the exhibit, because of an exhibit that is sort of a physical one is very different from what we will show you today. This exhibit today is meant not only to be an exhibit, but also to be a resource, sort of long-term resource for research and for teaching of the Hispano-Filipino literature. And so there is much more text. There are many, many sources that are given for further investigation, and I hope you will enjoy both the sort of the visual part of the exhibit, but also the intellectual work that went into it. And that was mostly Marlon who had done this. So thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy the exhibit.
Thank you, Barbara. I think one of the greatest joys of working with this team is that I was able to put Barbara, who's my Spanish side, and Susan, who's our Southeast Asian Studies librarian on the other side to put up this exhibit. So I wonder if Susan would like to give us some thoughts about this exhibit and say hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Uh, the exhibit and the workings of that exhibit really represent the most diversified presentation of Hispano-Filipino sources that has ever been presented by the University of Michigan. In large measure, of course, it is Dr. Marlon James Salas has been responsible for selecting the items, and every one of us owes him a profound appreciation. Without these sources, the world would have a few remnants of the pre-1900 world of these islands. I do have, because I've been collecting those materials, which I did not know really, I basically wanted to create a Spanish period in our collection, but has never been able to do that. So there is an absence in the Philippine history, but it doesn't have to be the case. It has to be, on one side, the National Archives, the Newberry Library, and the varied collection of UM. It needs to be surveyed again, cataloged, and finding aid created in order to supplement the materials represented here in the exhibit. No one group or committee has undertaken this massive project of an exhaustive search in America, but also much remains to be done in China, in the Philippines, and beyond. So as part of this group, I see the need to bring forth. So thank you, Marlon, for letting me know that it was a good collection after all.
Thank you, Susan. I think I will now call on Charlotte Theater, who has been working with us since last year. So Charlotte is our Michigan scholar, library scholar, who was selected to work on what started out as a physical exhibit. And then we recruited her to convert what she did into a virtual exhibit. And now she's here. Charlotte.
Thanks, Marlon. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Like Marlon and Barbara both said, we were originally designing this to be in person, and then we moved it to online, which really, it really transformed sort of what we talked about and how we talked about it. And ultimately, I think it gave us some capabilities that we didn't have with an in-person exhibit. The ability to link out to a lot of different archives has been really cool. And I think it reflects the sort of network that the materials do as well, connecting us to all these different places that the sources come from. And that's a really cool thing to me. Overall, I think sort of designing the exhibit really made me appreciate the process of translation, not just because of our subject matter, but because of the communication we had to go through ourselves. We had to communicate as a team that was not sharing an office space at any point. We had to communicate between everyone's different skill sets and decide what we wanted the takeaways of the exhibit to be, and how are we going to communicate these takeaways to our audience now that it's online rather than in person. And how do we arrange the text and the images to make those points effectively, but also ethically? We include some disturbing images in some places in this exhibit, and there are ethical implications to exposing our audience to those, but then there's also the ethical implications of not including the images and the text that demonstrates the violence that occurred during American imperialism in the Philippines and the active role that the University of Michigan had in that imperialism. So overall, this was a big learning curve for me as well. We were also transferring things. We had to get everything scanned and copied and uploaded. And so there's also the transfer of materials from physical to digital, and then moving those around in the digital space from Google Drive to a website building platform. So all of that was a lot of cool things to learn. And I'm also, like Marlon said, I'm an undergraduate. And so this is the first real exhibit that I've gotten to help design, which is really cool because I want to go into exhibit design in a future career. And I'm really lucky to have gotten to do this as an undergraduate and with such an awesome team of experts who I could learn so much from, and who've been just wonderful and supportive, because I've been finishing my last year of college during a pandemic while we worked on this. And so overall, I just want to say a big thank you to the team, because I think it really was the fact that we had such a great team that let us bring this all together so effectively.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And Charlotte has really been like the point person for all of this, because like we were just giving her ideas, but she was the one pressing the buttons and uploading things and labeling things. So yeah, it's quite challenging. And finally, we have, of course, to thank Julia, who is my graduate research assistant for this second seminar. Julia collaborated with the exhibit, and she was also doing all the coordination work for all the events today, all the Zoom links, and contacting everyone. So, Julia, I wonder if you can unmute yourself and say some words.
Sure. Oh, thank you so much. I'm just relieved that all of my links went off and everyone everyone got here and it went smoothly. And I want to kind of echo that it was really great to work with this team, and I loved this talk and I loved the talks this morning. And I think that one thing that I really valued about this project was that we got to do like truly collaborative writing, with Marlon writing the exhibit and me and Charlotte like popping in and writing kind of like descriptive captions for the pictures. And I'm just really grateful that I had an opportunity to like write and edit with other people, which is something that is really important for people to do in the humanities, but it's a rare opportunity that we actually get to do these kinds of things together. And I think Charlotte is going to be a great museum design exhibit designer. I messed that up, sorry. So yeah, thank you guys so much. I've really been enjoying this.
Well, thank you so much. So that's that. I really just wanted to have the space to thank everyone. I would also like to thank Colin Garon of Anthropology, who we hijacked last minute to be our Chinese translators, because there were several Chinese texts that we wanted to be translated as well, and we don't read Chinese. So we got another research assistant to join us, and he's not unfortunately unable to join us this afternoon. I wonder, Charlotte, if you could paste the link to the chat so that they can access it. We're giving you the link now. And please know that this is very much a running exhibit, as it were. It's, as Susan said, impossible to put everything there because of the limitations of not being able to physically go to the library, to physically enter our archives and see what we have, and to scan materials as quickly as possible. But here you have a first version, perhaps, and hopefully this will be this will grow into a bigger project in the future, especially now that we are forced to stay at home and do things digitally. So thank you so much, everyone. And please join us for the next installment of the Sawyer seminar of the Department of Comparative Literature next term. I think we'll have 2 seminars coming up. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat po, and bye-bye.